welcome everybody. This is the Eastern Region Virtual Short Course. It's a combination of our Green Express and the Knoxville's Ground Management Short Course that's took place for, they've been doing it for 49 years. We've only been doing it for 23 years down in Chattanooga.
Yeah, it's my pleasure today, of course, to introduce almost the entire Soil, Plant, and Pest Center. First is Dr. Windham, of course, Dr. Alan Windham with the University of Tennessee. He is a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology. Alan works at the Soil, Plant, and Pest Center in Nashville, and his PhD is from North Carolina State University in Plant Pathology and Soil Science. Now, Alan works on emerging plant diseases, and always enjoy watching his talks because, he has a lot of real-world experience. And I learned something yesterday in his images. He does a great job of putting the dates on a lot of the photos, and I need to learn to get better at that so we can see how things change through time. Now, Alan's instrumental, of course, in plant diagnosis, particularly this last year without having a diagnostician at the Soil, Plant, and Pest Center. And with that, Alan, we're happy to have you. Look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Lee. It's a pleasure to get to kick this off this morning. And I'd like to thank Lee Rumble and Tom Stebbins. Tom and I go way back, and Tom's a super duper plant pathologist and a lot more, and just a super person. And I've worked with him for a long time. And Lee, I've known him before he was an extension agent, comes from a arboriculture family here in Nashville, and just appreciate both of you. So I'm going to talk about kind of a review of 2020. Every slide that I show you is going to be that I took in 2020. So, even this year in the first week of January, and this is a Hicks U screen showing some discoloration, and it looks like it's moving. The client was worried about it moving in the foliage. Well, the foliage was just a symptom of what was happening below ground. Actually, when we looked at the roots, the problem was a root issue, most likely root rot. And when people contact me about a plant problem, I'm always interested in the health of the whole root, of the whole plant, especially what the roots look like. Sometimes people get caught up in what the foliage is looking like, if it's chlorotic, yellowed, dead, but I'm always interested in root health. So be sure to look at the roots. One of the things that we get to do is we get to, and what actually makes my job interesting is things that are infrequent, that we don't see very often. This is rose rust up at the Plateau Research and Education Center of UT Ag Research in Cumberland County, where we've got our rose rosette trials. And we were walking through looking at roses and evaluating them for rose rosette in August. And I noticed this rust. Highly unusual to see rose rust in Tennessee. Usually it's something deep south. If you go to the West Coast, it's really common. And the interesting thing, there wasn't one, but two distinct rusts in the field on particular roses, with the orange pustules on the underside of the leaves. And this rust is actually producing two spores, the small yellow Uridenia spores and the dark long brown Telia spores, which is unusual. So yeah, it makes it interesting. So, the one thing I tell you out there in the audience probably are, as likely as I, or more likely than I, to find something new because you're out looking at landscapes. In 2019, landscape manager brought this in for us to ID, and it was a rust on American hornbeam. So every time I see something I've never seen before, I always go to what's called a host index to see where it's been reported. Now, the interesting thing about this particular disease is rust on American hornbeam was there has not been a rust reported on hornbeam in the U.S. So that was just right here in Nashville. And talking to Amy Desmukes, an extension agent here in Middle Tennessee, she told me about an arborist had shown her this on European hornbeam a few weeks earlier. So I looked at that. So of course, one thing you're interested in when you see something new is, well, will it overwinter? Will we see it the next year? And yes, it did overwinter. I went to the the home and looked at these trees in October. Actually, from street view, they looked fine, but as you got closer, there was a lot of rust on these leaves. Where did it come from? Well, since it's been reported on European hornbeam in Europe, probably it was probably imported on some European hornbeam. But so far, it doesn't seem to be very damaging. So what was probably one of the more interesting ideas I did in 2020? Well, this photo was sent in from an extension agent in Fentress County, and it was his client had titled this "Alien Egg." So what it is, it's a fungus sclerosum. Well, you know, all a sclerosum is just a mass of tight mycelium that the fungus uses to overwinter or survive really tough environmental conditions. And usually they are microscopic, or if you can see them with the naked eye, they're probably the size of a BB or smaller. So what makes this so unusual is it's hard, it's woody, and it can weigh up to 8 pounds. And it can be buried 3 feet deep in the soil. So a common name for this is tuckahoe. And, you know, I've only seen this a couple times in my career, so fairly unusual. And, you know, I had to tell the client that no, it's not an alien egg. It is a fungus, but it's one called Woofoporia extensa. And another common name for it is Indian bread, where they would pound these down into a flour-like substance and make like a tortilla-like, bread-like food with it. You just never know from year to year what you're going to find. So if you don't follow us on Facebook, I would encourage you to do that. We're already putting up new material for 2021. We've reached, I think, 9,000 followers now. So give us a follow. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, you can do so I'm at UTPlantDoc, or just search for me by name and you can find me. And I'll put up interesting things about plant diseases that I see throughout the year. So let's talk about some abiotic issues, things like drought, stress, freeze injury, nutritional pH issues, and herbicide injury. I think one thing that sometimes people forget is that a drought can have long-term effects on woody plants. And, you know, it's interesting, last year when I was filling in for the diagnostician position, early 2020 I was looking at a lot of evergreen plants and a lot of plants that I don't normally see. But it's interesting because we had this flash drought in fall of 2019, and yet by winter last year, people had already forgotten about it. But the plants didn't, and we saw a lot of plants. And I saw a lot of plants in the spring I don't normally see, like green giant arborvitae that was showing some necrosis. And didn't see any fungal cankers or needle blights, anything. I just attributed this to the drought. I also looked at a lot of, I probably looked at more Hinoki cypress last year than I've looked at in my whole career. And generally, I just got in foliage to look at needles, and they were clean. They were brown, but there was nothing on them. No mites, no insect damage, no needle blight. But I did get this plant, and this was a whole plant. And one thing that was clear when I got it was that the roots were dead. And I did assay it for Phytophthora root rot. It was negative. So, you know, you can kill a conifer, too little water, too much water. So not sure exactly what happened here, but the roots were dead. It didn't seem to be from a root rot. Of course, Leyland cypress, anytime we have a drought, it's always going to be a kind of a poster child for damage from fungal canker diseases like Ceridium canker. This was a shot I took about a year ago, January 2020, of Leyland cypress in an unirrigated landscape in the Cool Springs area of Franklin. And generally what we look for, if you want us to diagnose a fungal canker disease, basically, if you looked at one of those branches and kind of looked in the canopy, went down to where there's resin flowing out of the stem, that's usually where the canker is. So it kills that tissue so that everything past there will die. So if you want us to diagnose it, if you want to know if it's Ceridium or whatever, or, you know, whichever fungus might be present, be sure to send us the part of the plant that has resin on it, because that's where it is. So how does this progress? I went back in July 2020 looked at those trees again, and this is how it had progressed. So what it does is the fungus continues to run down the branch, killing larger branches as it goes. So Leyland cypress, not a horrible plant in a, it's, if you have it in a irrigated landscape, it can do quite well, but unirrigated is really prone to damage after we have a drought. Well, not everything I saw was due to the drought. I mean, we did see plants like Blue Pacific, juniper with Phytophthora root rot. Blue Pacific is unfortunately one of the shore type junipers that seem to be pretty sensitive to Phytophthora. As a matter of fact, if I'm participating in a workshop where I'm using live samples, if I want to go find an example of root rot, I often will go to a big box store and just look and see if they have Blue Pacific, and if they do, usually I can find it. It's that common. What about freeze injury? Here in Nashville, we didn't have one late freeze, but we had 2 late freezes last year, and some plants showed typical damage, such as this burning, bleached damage to Japanese maple, very common. On conifers, such as yew, if they were already growing during the freeze, then those tender shoots were burned. But as you can see, new growth continued after the fact, so no long-term damage. One of the great things about being located at the Soil Plant Pest Center is we can get help from our colleagues over across the building in the soil lab, and they'll help us solve issues. For instance, we had a client that brought in this for me to look at last spring, and thought, pretty severe chlorosis on azalea. And so we asked him to bring in some soil, and he did, and the pH was 7.6. Now you would think with pH that high that it would always be iron chlorosis, but let me warn you, it can be, but it's not always iron that's deficient in these leaves. In some cases, it's going to be manganese. So if you sprayed this with an iron chelate and it didn't green up, it could be because it's not iron that's the issue. It could be manganese that's not available to the plant. So just keep that in mind. In a very interesting sample that I got last year, I had a call from a nursery here in Middle Tennessee that had sold some dogwoods to a grower out of state, and the grower wasn't, he had had them for a year, but he said, they were showing some yellowing and dieback, and he wanted to know what was going on. So again, this is unusual where you get the whole plant, but one of the things that I was delighted to see was how healthy the roots looked. You usually don't get the roots to look at. So these were trees in containers, and when I washed out the root system, the roots were just in great shape, which made me feel pretty good. So since there was interveinal necrosis, as you can see in this upper right-hand corner, and actually the upper left-hand corner too, we got some of the media and sent it to the soil lab. And basically what they found out was that soluble salts were almost non-existent, which indicates a level of fertility. And also most every major nutrient was very low, as well as some of the minor nutrients. So actually the issue was just a fertility issue. It was actually nothing to do with as far as the disease. For herbicide injury, we normally refer people that think there's been a misuse of herbicides to the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. If you're not aware of this, you can just Google Tennessee Department of Agriculture pesticide, and it will take you to their pesticide page where you can, if you feel like something's been misused, you can fill out a pesticide complaint form that will be followed up by one of their pesticide inspectors. But we do have people ask about things. We can't assay the plants for these materials, but we can look at the symptoms, and based on our experience, kind of render an opinion, such as this sycamore that looks like it's been exposed to phenoxy herbicide when the tree was rapidly growing. That's when it's most sensitive to herbicide. Often what I see on a broadleaf tree is there will be some initial damage from when there was some drift, and then often the tree will grow out of it. And so you'll have a branch that has normal growth, and you go back down the branch in time and you'll see this distorted leaves. So that's the thing that you hope happens. Over the past several years, since it appears that limelight and little limelight, panicled hydrangea are pretty sensitive to glyphosate. If you get it on them, the next flush of growth they have is going to be really dwarfed and distorted. Generally, every time I see this, glyphosate or a Roundup-like product has been sprayed close to these plants. These generally do not recover, so you're looking at replacement. This was an interesting one. This is, sometimes over the years, I've been involved with some instances where people have been sold something that's better than Roundup. It's going to be longer lasting. And yeah, it is. It's basically a soil sterilant like Bromacil that's used on railway right-of-ways and around power substations, the gravel and stuff where you don't want anything to grow. But unfortunately, they had used that in this parking lot on these really nice maples. When I went to look at it with the client thought this was a water issue, but the soil was nice and moist in these islands. But I said, you know, what's one thing that's missing? What's missing in these islands are weeds. There's no weeds. So I said, find out what your staff used to kill the weeds or prevent weed growth in these islands. And that's when he came back with, they had used a product that included Bromacil. So this was actually, this photo was taken in 2011. I went back in 2020 and looked at this parking lot islands, and all that are left are stumps. So they probably, by this time, even the Bromacil should be long gone. They could replant, but it's kind of a warning, be careful. So I don't know if this happened where you were at, but in May in Middle Tennessee, we had some straight line winds that went through that played havoc with some of our trees. And even here at the center at our office, we had some white pines that were planted 60 years ago that were casualties of the straight line winds. So, you know, one thing that I knew was that over the years, I've seen this fungus growing around the base of some of the eastern white pines here. It's Phaeolus swinitzi, root and butt rot of pine. And basically, in some of our pine plantings, it's just going right down the row and just kill them. So when this tree was wind thrown, it's not too often that you get to look at the root system of a pine like this. One of the things I was interested in was that what was root health like, and actually root health was very poor. I'd say about 80% of the roots on this tree were dead. So what I found was I found two fungi that I didn't even know existed here on these pines at the center. One is Heredobacinion, some root rot, and you can see the fruiting bodies of the fungus on the roots. And then the lower right-hand corner, Armillaria, there were some black rhizomorphs, just real thick strands of mycelium. So actually, there were actually 3 fungi here on the center that were causing root rot of pine, but very hard to diagnose, you know, unless it's wind thrown or unless the fungus produces a mushroom like the Phaeolus does. So for Armillaria, what we sometimes look for, we look for the clusters of the honey mushroom in the fall. And you may have been out hiking in the woods and seen a log that's down where the bark's removed, and you see these are rhizomorphs, and these usually tell you that it's Armillaria is present and it causes a root and butt rot. But it's just, you know, those are just really hard things to diagnose because we just don't have a good view of what's going on below ground. At Granbury School here in South Nashville, we lost some ancient beech. You know, it's not unusual. This beech was about 4 feet DBH, and not uncommon for an old beech to have some decay, heart rot like that, but it just twisted right off with the straight line winds. So let's look at boxwoods. Boxwoods were a frequent flyer in 2020, and so often, you know what, I often ask people that would, the landscape managers that would submit samples, I'm like, you know, it'd be really helpful if you'd send me a photo of what the boxwood looks like. So sometimes we get some that look like this. And when I look at a boxwood like this, I really don't see anything that strikes me as a foliar disease. I'm thinking when I see a boxwood, it looks like this. I'm thinking below ground problems, maybe planted too deep, too wet. It's not usually too dry that causes this, but there are some root rots too, like Phytophthora root rot or even black root rot. Now, last year about this time, I had posted some images on our Facebook page of root rot on conifers, and someone asked, well, what would healthy roots look like? And I'm like, oh, that's a good question. So I did post some images. Okay, this is what you should look for when you're looking for healthy roots. Well, I did that. I washed out this root mass from a boxwood sample, and actually this looks pretty good. Basically what you look for are those white root tips. If you see a lot of those, then generally the roots are in pretty good shape. But sometimes if you look a little closer, even on boxwood, well, Japanese holly has a big problem with black root rot. Things like Helleri holly, sky pencil, Hugendorn, soft touch, all are susceptible to black root rot. But boxwood can be too. Generally, it's going to be in soils that are near neutral, near 7 pH, or maybe even a little higher. But this was a sample that I got in and looked for black root rot and actually found it because of the black resting spores that were in the root tissue. So generally it doesn't kill a boxwood, but can make it look less than we would want it to. Other root issues that you might find associated with boxwoods are root knot nematode. This was a sample that Amy Desmukes brought by for me to look at, but a really good example of the damage that root knot nematode does to boxwood with all the galled roots and swollen roots there. So that's very, if you go back and think about the healthy root system, you just look like this is very different looking, and it's due to root knot. Now I will say this, in landscape beds, I don't see root knot that often. So this was typical. A lot of boxwoods that I looked at that were brought into the lab last year, thin canopies. Wasn't boxwood blight, it was a combination of leaf miner and then Voluttella blight followed up on that. So leaf miner, in this case, the leaf miners emerge when new growth is being produced because they're going to lay their new eggs in that new growth. So it's kind of synchronous. If you see new growth on boxwood in the spring and you look closely, you might see these little gnat-like flies flying around. Those are the adult boxwood leaf miner. So it really is a good idea if the planting has a history of leaf miner to protect it with a fungicide, and Dr. Hale will probably talk more about that later this morning. So what I was interested in a lot of the samples that came in look like this, not only the leaf miner, but also the brown leaves from Voluttella. And what I found was that a lot of the leaves that had this Voluttella sporulation, where you could just flip the leaves over and look for this pink to coral colored fungal growth, a lot of the leaves had been infested with leaf miner. And the same, this year, this was just last week, I was looking at some boxwoods with a client, and thin, some brown leaves, but just severely infested with boxwood leaf miner. So always look for that. And then Voluttella blight was following up again. For Voluttella, you can sometimes shear back the foliage, spray it with chlorothalonil or a similar fungicide, and protect that new growth. Let's talk a little bit about boxwood blight. During the spring, summer, and fall, you can look for leaf spots on the foliage or leaves that have large brown spots. During the winter months, the most reliable symptom are these little black lesions on green twigs where the leaves have fallen off. And for instance, this was last week. I was looking at some boxwoods with a client in Belmead, and these were losing leaves. Not a lot of leaves on the stems that were infected with boxwood blight, but the black twigs were there. So this is pretty typical of what you might see on a plant that is infected with boxwood blight. So let me tell you what, one client that I've worked with who's a grounds manager here in Nashville has had some clients with boxwood blight. This is actually in West Nashville. Check out the date here. This is October 2018. This is on a cultivar called Grace Hendricks Phillips, which has been listed as moderately susceptible, but it looks pretty susceptible here. So what I suggested was that these plants were so involved with boxwood blight that they be pulled to be cleaned up. And I wasn't even suggesting that they go back with boxwood in this area. However, the client's client had different ideas. They were like, no, we want you to try to save these. So what he did was he cut them back, started spraying with a alternating propiconazole and chlorothalonil. So this is October 2018. Let's go to the next year. This is June 2019. Same plants. He sent me this photo in June 2019 where he had cut them back, sprayed them, and there was no sign of boxwood blight. Let's go to another client. This is February 2018, so almost 3 years ago. And this was a client that had a lot of boxwoods in Belmead. Large boxwoods in the background. This little formal garden here was infected with boxwood blight. You can see on the larger rounded boxwood on the corner here down low, there's some damage. And on the linear planting, there's some damage. And the inset photo there is from this, where you could see infection of the leaves. So this was this is February 2018. So this had been active on this plant probably since the fall of 2017. So I followed up on this to see how his sprays would work. He basically was spraying this during the spring and fall every 2 weeks, alternating propiconazole, chlorothalonil again, and then spraying occasionally in the summer and scouting frequently for symptoms. So let's go to September 2020, same plants. You can see the hole there in that linear planting of where the boxwood blight had been, but otherwise very little damage from boxwood blight, and it had not moved to the larger plants in the background there. Okay, third client of his, look at the date. This is September 2020. This was a client he showed me where he had boxwood blight, and it was pretty extensive in this planting. So he started his spray regimen, and he sent me this photo the following month, and there was already new growth coming out. And October, that's a little bit late, but he didn't have much control over this. It wasn't due to any pruning. It was just due to the suppression of the boxwood blight fungus. So one of the interesting things was that I took samples of this boxwood back to the lab, tried to isolate it. He had already sprayed this with propiconazole, and I could not get the fungus to grow out of the plant. So that's actually good. I mean, that's, I would like to have it grow to confirm it, but basically what it's telling me is that the fungicide suppressing growth and suppressing sporulation, there was none of either. So in 2020, this article came out in the Journal of Environmental Horticulture about the curative fungicide activity against the boxwood blight pathogen. And he looked at a lot of different fungicides. If you look at the chemicals used in the study, some really common ones, Heritage, Insignia, Torque, and there were several that worked really well, but propiconazole, he used a generic propiconazole. And one of the things that he found out with it, it's absolutely stopped sporulation of boxwood blight. So basically what I'm saying here, a couple of things. Number one is for that special client that has the means to pay someone to spray their boxwoods, you don't have to throw out a boxwood that has boxwood blight. It doesn't have to go to the landfill. Couple things you need though, if you consider doing that. Look at this boxwood. It had lots of green stems, lots of viable buds, and once it was sprayed, those buds broke and it started growing again. If you've got boxwoods that all the stems are brown, straw colored, then those probably should go and are not worth trying to remediate. But if you've got some green foliage, if you get green stems, and there's a prospect of getting it under control and getting new growth, then I think you've seen in these three examples, although these are not research, this is just observations that I've made working with this grounds manager here in Nashville, that you can remediate. So what I've told him is, don't know when to tell you to stop this regimen of spraying, but if you do stop, you're really going to have to scout pretty often to make sure that it doesn't come back. And then I was glad to see this publication that I mentioned come out, and basically it reinforced things that we were observing in the field, that there are some good products. So you can look this up. I think this is open access, Journal of Environmental Hort. You could go online and read this article. If you want to look at a publication or give this to a client for some information about boxwood blight, this is one that I wrote. I think it came out in 2020 or 2019, but it's available on the UT Extension website. So look at that. Okay, what else did I look at last year? Anthracnose diseases. Okay, let's think back to spring 2020. What was it like? Well, it was cool and wet, so actually it was pretty favorable for anthracnose diseases. So when you have a cool, wet spring, you're going to see anthracnose on shade trees like this, on this oak. And typical for anthracnose symptoms, basically the fungus will follow some of the major veins and then move outward. So it's pretty typical. But also pretty typical of anthracnose on this oak. By the time that I had seen this, the weather had changed. It was drier, it was warmer. The tree had put out new growth that was not affected. Well, let's look at a similar, different fungus, but similar disease on sycamore. Look at this tree at the Warner Parks Nature Center here in West Nashville. This is a sycamore just hammered with sycamore anthracnose. And this is May 2020. And typical of the oak that I just showed you, again, the fungus is following that main vein and then moving out and killing tissue as long as it's cool and wet. But what happens when it's dry? Let's look at that. This is the same tree in July 2020. It's now not cool and wet, it's drier, it's hotter, and the tree, this is just 2 months later, had totally foliated. Nothing had happened other than the weather changed. So I think sometimes if clients are patient, especially with anthracnose, the tree will put out another flush of growth when the weather changes and it's not conducive for anthracnose. And just another shot. So this is another shot of sycamore anthracnose. And I think what happens, sometimes people that see sycamore that's dying, they think it's anthracnose that's killed the tree, but probably what has happened is that the sycamore is infected with bacterial leaf scourge. These are fairly easy to distinguish because I went back and looked. Most of the photos I have of scorching on sycamore is in September. So this is not in the spring when it's cool and wet. This is late summer, early fall. This is bacterial leaf scorch on probably maybe a London plane tree. This was on Haywood Lane here in Nashville. And again, these are two shots that I took in September. One September 2018, one September 2012. So if you're having sycamore that's browning up, that's dying, it's probably not anthracnose, especially if it's happening in midsummer, late summer, or fall. It's probably bacterial leaf scourge. Now, as far as controlling bacterial leaf scourge, it's difficult. There's no curative treatment. Sometimes arborists will try injecting trees with antibiotics or using a growth regulator product around the base. And sometimes they'll get a nice response from that, but it's just something that has to be discussed with the client, decide if they want to commit to something long-term. Also anthracnose, red maple and silver maple are two trees that see if we have a cool, wet spring, we'll see anthracnose on those. And again, most of the lesions here are along major veins. But once the weather changed, this was here at our office last year. Later in the summer, I could hardly find any symptoms of anthracnose on these maples. The new growth was perfectly healthy. What else on oaks? We got a few samples of oak leaf blister last year, these puckered lesions on the leaves, the fungus. Where is it right now? It's, well, if you had a tree that had oak leaf blister, the fungus is probably on the bud scales right now. And as those leaf buds open, it will infect the developing leaves and form these blisters. So this is one thing that I got asked about, but let me show you a frequent flyer last year, and it was this leaf spot on oak. This is a fungal leaf spot on oak that I got a lot of questions about. A lot of emails of pictures of this, a lot of samples of this last year from all over the state. I think the first sample I ever got of this was from the Knoxville area, from Dr. Karen Hughes, mycologist there at UTK. And I think when I first saw this at first glance, I was like, oh, well, that looks like just an older leaf blister, but it's not. It's a fungus called Monachia, and it causes a leaf spot. So very visible. The symptoms stay around all season, but is it damaging? Generally not. Generally, these leaves will hang on the tree all season. They're still functioning, maybe not as well as they would if they were perfectly healthy, but in most cases, it's not a big deal. So even though this was a frequent flyer, it's not one that I would be overly concerned about if I had this on an oak. In late summer, fall, one thing that we see here every year in Nashville and sugar maple is a leaf spot caused by a fungus called Monachia. And basically, probably the most detrimental thing it does here is it'll knock the leaves off of this tree in early fall so that you get very little fall color from a tree that's susceptible to this. Now, it tends to be something that is hit and miss, scattered. There are other maples that were close to this maple at our office that, you know, there's a couple of these maples that get it every year. There are other maples surrounding it that are not affected by it one bit. So it tends to probably have to do with genetics, and you have some that are susceptible in a population and others that are not. What else did I see as far as foliar diseases last year? This is scab on crabapple. Most of our apple cultivars and crabapple cultivars that are sold are resistant to this, but not all. If you see a crabapple that's defoliated by mid-June or late June, it's probably due to this disease. So, you know, if I was buying a crabapple or apple, I would make sure that I chose a cultivar that is resistant to scab. Otherwise, you'll have this issue every year. The lesions are kind of feathered at the edges, uneven margins. But just make sure if you're choosing a crabapple, make sure that it's resistant to scab. How do you find the information? You could go to Google and just Google crabapple diseases, and you'd come up with many different publications of charts with all the cultivars and what diseases they are susceptible and resistant to. All right, let's talk a little bit about powdery mildew. The first time I ever saw powdery mildew was in 1993, sample from Cumberland County. I think I had worked here 8 years, had never seen powdery mildew on dogwood. So when I did see it, I was like, wow, this is unusual, because by that time I had looked at a lot of dogwood samples, processing them for dogwood and anthracnose. So it does damage the tree. As you can tell, the leaves are kind of strap shaped, they're curling. Usually a tree that's really sensitive to this will set fewer flower buds, and it's going to grow slower. Studies we did were controlling powdery mildew in nurseries. We found out there was a significant stunting due to powdery mildew. Why? Well, for one reason, all that mycelium has penetrated the leaf, so it's losing a lot of water, so it tends to scorch. And about this time, a lot of people, and now I'll have more on this in just a second, but if you talk to people in the Deep South, they said that dogwoods really started declining in the Deep South about the time that powdery mildew arrived. And a lot of nurseries in the Deep South quit growing their dogwoods or even offering them because of the issues with this disease. So what happens if we look up close at a leaf that has powdery mildew? This is a shot that I took from rose with powdery mildew, and you have all these powdery mildew spores, and they're in chains. And the interesting thing about this fungus is, I'm not sure where you might think the most mature spore is, but it's the one on the tip. So generally what happens when you have powdery mildew, when it's sporulating like this, about noon every day, the spore will break off. Actually, all of these mature spores will break off about the same time, about midday. And they are wind blown randomly. And if they land on a susceptible host and it's humid enough, they'll germinate and penetrate the host. So powdery mildew doesn't need wet weather, it just needs high humidity. And that's why it's such a common disease. So we're used to seeing powdery mildew on plants that look like this. It's one of the diseases that's easiest to diagnose because of the presence of a sign of disease, and that's the white mycelium. But what I get questions about every year, and I saw this last year, is that this is also a symptom of powdery mildew. Now, in this case, the plant has almost like a hypersensitive reaction where there's tissue that's actually killed where the mildew spores land and start to infect. But when we look at this leaf with some magnification, there's lots of mycelium here. It's just not as visible because the plant's trying to stop it. And so if you see these blackened dogwood leaves, if you look with a hand lens, you can see the powdery mildew, but this is powdery mildew. And when you see it on new growth like this, it can really slow down the growth of the plant. It reduces growth, increases water loss, and reduces flower bud production on dogwood. So just one thing that's new, what's new in the Appalachian series of dogwoods that you may not know about? Well, this dogwood is our first pink dogwood resistant to powdery mildew, and it's called Cornus Florida Erica's Appalachian Sunrise. There are a few nurseries, not many, but there are a few nurseries already growing this in Franklin County. And I just did a Google search for this, and I saw that White Flower Farm had these for sale this spring. So these should become more available, but it's kind of exciting because all of our other Appalachian series of dogwoods have white flowers. This is our first red or pink dogwood that has resistance to powdery mildew. So availability is pretty scarce right now, but just keep an eye out for this one. And like I said, there are some nurseries that specialize in dogwoods in Franklin County that are growing this. What else is going on? Well, Brother Mark has been working with some nurseries in South Louisiana to see if our Appalachian series of dogwoods could tolerate the heat. And because they're resistant to powdery mildew, maybe kind of reintroduce flowering dogwood to the deep south. This is Alan Owens, who's retired from LSU. He was their horticulture specialist. You may know him. And he works for Bracy Nursery and another nursery in southern Louisiana. But what they found out over about a 2 or 3 year period is that 4 of the 5 Appalachian dogwoods that we have did great in their growing conditions. This is in near Amite City, Louisiana, so just north of Hammond, Louisiana. And they were very tickled with the growth that they got of our dogwoods. I think Appalachian Spring was the only one that didn't do well in their heat in the deep south, but all the other ones, Appalachian Blush, Mist, Snow, and Joy, grew exceptionally well. They were very happy with it. So they look to have these to sell for their clients there in the deep south. All right, so that's it. That's kind of an overview of 2020, and I've got a few minutes for questions.
Great, Alan. Thank you very much.
So there was a question about powdery mildew affects monardas. Yes, I mean, that's, I've been to the Discovery Garden at the Plateau Research and Education Center, and they have some monardas that get it every year. There probably are some cultivars of monarda that are resistant. Off the top of my head, I can't name them, but I bet if you looked, you might find some. But yeah, very common. I'd say the only plant that it's may fool you that has powdery mildew is sedum. When a sedum like Autumn Joy gets powdery mildew, if it's planted in a little too much shade, you get kind of a scabby lesion that looks nothing like powdery mildew. But just about every other plant, it's pretty easy. So there's a question about the Leyland cypress with the canker disease and what was the timing of progression. Well, the first photo was January of 2020 and the second photo was July of 2020. So about 5 to 6 months. So there's a question about distinguishing elm yellows and Dutch elm disease on American elm. So basically what I've seen is this with Dutch elm disease, and I've already had a question about this, and there's somebody bringing a sample tomorrow for us to look at. Usually you'll have some sectional browning or dieback, but what I usually do is take a knife and peel the bark off of a symptomatic branch, maybe 1 inch to 1/2 inch diameter, and look for streaking, alternating streaking, a brown streaking and white sapwood. Now with Elm yellows, what often happens is the whole tree would turn yellow and then shed its leaves. And I looked at some of those. And, you know, as far as field observations, with elm yellows, you can cut some small branches, take the bark off, put those into a mason jar for about 30 minutes and open the top, and you'll get this really strong wintergreen smell if it's elm yellows. So I saw that elm yellows I saw a couple years ago in Princeton Elm in Murfreesboro, and I sent photos to a friend of mine at Cornell. She forwarded them to Wayne Sinclair, who's retired now from Cornell, but kind of known as Mr. Elm. And he sent me an email and told me the first case of elm yellows ever diagnosed in Tennessee was in Hamilton County around 1942. So it's been here, but elm yellows was not widespread. So the mason jar test, I did that during the summer months when there were active symptoms. And the other way to diagnose elm yellows, besides whole tree being affected, leaves turn yellow and dropping, is in this case, if you take a knife and you peel back the bark, rather than having streaking of brown like you would Dutch elm disease, you'll have all of the sapwood is kind of a butterscotch color. Okay, so one question is, how would you suggest managing pesticide injury? You know, I often get that when we see some injury, and I'll say, you know, basically all we can do is wait and see what happens. You might remember in Prellis, that was a short-lived turf herbicide for broadleaf weeds, and it was short-lived because it damaged conifers. And in Murfreesboro, there was a row of white pine that I noticed the damage on, and Tennessee Department of Ag confirmed that it was in Prellis. So I started taking photos every spring, and it was 4 years before normal growth returned to those trees. So of a row of pines I looked at, only one died, but the others, it took 4 years before normal growth returned, and it wasn't distorted. So otherwise, sometimes if it's like a phenoxy herbicide, like I said, it may be just that bit of new growth when that product drifted and contacted the tree, those leaves will be damaged. But then once that's gone, any new growth produced is okay. Let's see. Once Leyland cypress has the fungus, is there anything that can be done about it? Generally not, because generally by the time you see it, the damage is pretty extensive. So what we do say to prevent damage or drought, fungal canker damage to Leyland cypress, make sure that they're mulched and well watered, not under stress. So another question, how do you identify slime flux on cherry trees, and what can you do to prevent it? I can't say that I've seen slime flux that much on cherry. I do see gum mosses. Basically where there's injury or a wound, the tree will produce this sticky gummy-like sap that extrudes from the bark. And when I see that, basically I'm looking for a fungal canker disease or looking for a insect borer, like peach tree borer, something like that. There's a question about, have I ever seen white pine decline after a drought? Oh yeah. We'll see white pine that for what appears to be no good reason other than stress from a drought, it will start to turn yellow. Actually, the townhomes where I live now, we had 2 taken out that did that this year. And like I said earlier, when I was talking about drought, the effects on woody plants are long-term. Have I seen much dicamba drift damage? Actually, I have not. But I think if you talk to Carol Reese and some of the folks in West Tennessee, they would say, yeah, we've seen it on a lot of different plants. But I have not seen it or been involved. Where you see more herbicide injury, and what herbicide do you think? Probably the 2 most common ones that I see are the phenoxy herbicides that are used on pastures or lawns for broadleaf weeds in the spring, when a lot of our trees, shrubs, and flowers are actively growing. And you know, if you have multiple plant species that are showing symptoms, that's a pretty good indication that it is herbicide injury. The other one is the Roundup or glyphosate kind of sublethal dose. where you get a little too close when you're spraying, and you'll see the dwarfed growth once the tree starts growing again. Here's a question about gummosis in the upper canopy of black cherry. I mean, it's not there for no reason. There's a reason, and it could be a fungal canker disease, or even something like peachtree borer. Usually see lower on the trunk, but lesser peachtree borer can be throughout the tree. So just kind of take a knife and dig around in the area where there's gummosis and see if you can find what's going on. So a comment about ceridium canker. I agree. I mean, if you'll grow Leyland cypress where it's mulched, well watered, it can grow well. And if you go over into North Carolina, you'll see some monster Leyland cypress in Western North Carolina and the Charlotte area that just are tremendous. And they're obviously, maybe I don't know, their growing conditions are better than what we have here in Middle Tennessee.
Hey, Alan, what about pruning out? I saw an instance on Lookout Mountain where landscaper really did a good job of thinning branches as they were getting infected, thinning out Leyland cypress, even
Sure.
painting over the cuts. I don't know. It looked
You
good.
could try that, but you need to make sure that you're pruning below where the canker is.
Mm-hmm. Now this is right to the trunk.
So could white pine decline be due to root diseases that I saw at the lab? Absolutely. But it's just very hard to diagnose because we don't get a good look at the root system unless there's like a wind event like that happened here where I had a few pines to actually look at the root system. So yes, what's called white pine decline could absolutely be the result of phaeolus or armillaria or a nosum root rot. And in the absence of the fruiting bodies of the fungi, we're just kind of guessing. Someone asked about any new research on trichoderma soil applications. There's been a lot of research for a long time. My brother Mark, when he was doing a postdoc at Colorado State in the early 80s, he was working with a guy named Tex Baker that was really big into using trichoderma for biocontrol. So that research has continued all these years, and some of the products that you see on the market are the result of a lot of research by a lot of different people. So yeah, some of the biocontrol agents are good, and you know, a lot of applications there.
Did you miss that one about the boxwood with the knotty growth making a spongy ball larger than a golf ball? I think I didn't hear that. Several bushes had one or two. Some had lots of these growths. Any idea what causes these big?
So, you know, basically that sounds like crown gall, but I don't see that too often on boxwood, but I do see it on euonymus. And you might even see it on boxleaf euonymus, which looks a little bit like boxwood. But if it's like a spongy ball, I would think maybe crown gall. But it might be something you could take a photo of and send me to look at. Okay, now he says it was boxleaf euonymus. So yeah, it's probably crown gall. I think for fungal canker diseases, I generally suggest being proactive and keeping woody plants well watered during a drought to try to prevent the stress. Because, you know, this is the thing. Most woody plants are already, you know, there are epiphytes or endophytes. These fungi are already there. They're already in the tree. As long as that tree stays healthy, they're not going to do anything, but you let it get under stress, and that's when we see the fungal canker disease.
Well, very good. I want to thank you
Lee.
again.
Thanks.
Great, Alan.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
I'll give you a little introduction. This gives me great pleasure to introduce Eleanor Lopez to today's talk. I realized the lab really made an upgrade with Eleanor. I used to be in that position some years ago, and looking forward to working with Eleanor. She's new at Tennessee and new in August 2020. So she's an extension assistant with the plant pathogen, and she's also the insect, or helps with the insect diagnostics there too at the Soil Plant and Pest Center. She has her doctorate in plant medicine from the University of Florida, which is an interdisciplinary degree of plant pathology, entomology, nematology, soil science, weed science, and an emphasis on diagnostics. Sounds like a great program. She provides accurate and timely diagnosis of plant diseases and insects to clients, via distance diagnostics and also lab samples. And so our interests are broad and wide on sustainability, pests of emerging crops, and science communication. So I want to welcome Eleanor to this seminar today, and welcome to Tennessee.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning, y'all. Again, I'm Eleanor. You can also call me Ellie. And I'm excited to talk to y'all today about the Soil Plant and Pest Center, in particular the Plant Pest Lab that I'm in charge of, but also some of the other things that the center offers in terms of plant health. So a little bit about me. I am new to the University of Tennessee, but Nashville is home for me. So it's really, really nice to be back home. I started here in August of this past year. And a little bit about my background. I went to the University of San Diego for my undergraduate studies. I swam at the University of San Diego, and I did swim butterfly. So I think that was a little bit of foreshadowing for me studying entomology. But while I was there, I studied Spanish and environmental studies. And I'm not fluent in Spanish, but I can read, I can write it. So if there is anything that you or your clients might request in Spanish, I'm really happy to work with you to provide information in Spanish. After San Diego, I came back home to Nashville and I went to Lipscomb University, where I studied sustainability, and my concentration was on sustainable food systems. So I was looking a lot at the farm to table movement as it could apply to schools. So seeing how local farms could provide food directly to Metro Nashville public schools. So I'm a swimmer, I love to eat. I was really interested in food and looking at the whole system of food production and how it could be more environmentally friendly. And after I did that program, I realized that I really wanted to learn more about plants and their place in the system, but starting from how they grow, what makes them sick, and how we can keep our plants as healthy as possible. So I went down to the University of Florida, where I did a master's degree in entomology and nematology. And my project there was identifying arthropods in olives. So we think of olives as being more of a Mediterranean crop, right? And the Middle Eastern region and Greece, but they're actually being grown more and more frequently in the South, especially North Central Florida and Southern Georgia. So that was really interesting. And I learned a whole lot about specialty crops, woody crops for sure, the ornamental value of a lot of these plants, especially olives. Some of them are grown for cut foliage and not necessarily for olive oil or table olives in Florida. And while I was doing that research degree, I was also doing my Doctor of Plant Medicine degree, where, as Tom said, I had a lot of interdisciplinary hands-on diagnostic courses in plant pathology, in diagnostic work. And it really prepared me for this job. And I like to think that if I don't know the answer to something, I know someone who does. So I have a lot of really great connections, and I'm really thankful that I got to do this program and have those resources to figure out what's wrong with our plant health problems. So here at the center, my role is plant pathogen and insect diagnostics. I take physical samples that are mailed in or dropped off to the Soil Plant and Pest Center, and those are currently $15 for each individual plant that's submitted for a plant disease diagnosis, $15 for any insects that are submitted for diagnosis, and $30 for each golf course plug that's submitted. I'm also in the process of evaluating additional tests that I'm going to be able to provide soon, such as molecular methods of plant pathogen diagnosis. So if you're interested in being part of that survey and want to send me your email, I would be really happy to include you in that survey. And I also do distance diagnosis. So we have a specific portal for that purpose for the extension agents. So if you want to send Tom or Lee photos of your plant or insect problem, they can upload those and send them to me, or you can also directly email me photos. And from that, I can give you a good idea of whether or not I need a physical sample of the problem. So distance diagnosis is useful most of the time, but sometimes it's not always useful. So it's most useful for insect ID because insects are fairly distinct from each other. It can be more challenging when insects are in their immature stage. So things like caterpillars, fly maggots, beetle larvae, identifying those to species sometimes can be hard unless I have a physical sample of those. If you're needing the ID of a plant, especially weeds, those pictures of those are best if the plant is still in the ground. It's really hard to ID a plant if it's dried out, if it's dead, if there's no flowers or fruit on the plant. And while sometimes I can tell you if your plant has a specific disease, I can't always tell just from a picture. And this is because a lot of symptoms and signs of disease can be very similar. For example, a leaf spot might be caused by 3 different kinds of fungal organisms, but that leaf spot looks the same no matter what the organism that it is that's causing it. So I really will need a physical sample so that I'm giving you the best management recommendation possible. And if we are suspecting a plant disease, it really is helpful to have any background information that is available so that I can rule out environmental causes of disease. And when you are submitting a physical sample, like Alan said, it really is always helpful to send in a picture, even if you are submitting a physical sample, because seeing what's going on at the landscape scale is really, really helpful. So if you are taking a photo to send to an extension agent to send to me, there are a couple of things that I'd really like for you to keep in mind. It's really helpful to have something to scale the insect or the plant structure or the pathogen symptoms. So something like a coin that's always the same size no matter what, or a ruler. Those are both really great to always have in your picture when you're taking a picture of something up close or something that's small. So earlier I talked about how immature insects can be difficult to identify. So here we have a fly maggot, a moth caterpillar, and a beetle grub. And just by looking at these, I might say, oh, these are all just white worm-like bugs. I'm not sure what they are, unless I can see certain features. And here I can see certain features. So I always want to look for legs. Do we have legs? On this fly maggot, there's never going to be any legs. On caterpillars, we're always going to have legs near the head capsule and also near the end of the larva. And with beetles, the legs are usually only by the head capsule. Another part that we always want to look at when taking pictures of these immature insects are the head capsule. So fly maggots are never going to have this hardened head or chewing mouth parts. They have these little mouth hooks. So those are other features to be mindful of when you're taking pictures. The head capsule, the mouth parts, and any legs on any worm-like organisms that you find. So now I have a more interactive part of my presentation, and I want to test your knowledge about plant pathogens of hydrangea. So my question is, what's wrong with these hydrangeas? And your options are Cercospora, anthracnose, and powdery mildew. For this first question, for this first picture. So powdery mildew is one of the pathogens that I can most likely diagnose via a picture, via distance diagnostics, because it has really characteristic symptoms of this white fuzzy fungal growth. However, when we look at these other two leaves with very similar leaf spots in some cases, it can be a lot more difficult to tell just based on the symptoms what the causal agent is. And so with anthracnose of hydrangea and Cercospora leaf spot on hydrangea, I am going to need a physical sample to look for these spore structures under a compound microscope. So I just wanted to show these as an example of why sometimes I can tell you what's wrong or from a photo, and why sometimes it's going to be a little bit more difficult for me to tell what's wrong with a foliar leaf spot based on a photo. All right. So when you are submitting a physical sample for plants and insects, the entire cost of that is going to be the sample fee, which ranges from $15 for a plant disease diagnosis or an insect diagnosis, or $30 if you're submitting a golf course plug, and then the cost of shipping. And I will say that the faster you can ship it to me, the better I'll be able to diagnose what's going on with it, because more of the plant will still be alive. So when you go to the main website of the Soil Plant and Pest Center, you'll come up here to the Disease and Insect ID tab, and you'll drop down to Plant Pests. And the ones that I expect y'all to use the most as landscape professionals would be the Plant Disease tab, Golf Course Diagnosis tab, and Insect Identification tab. And when you click on these three tabs here, the submission sheets for each of those and how to submit them, sampling instructions, mailing instructions are also going to pop up over here on the right. So when you're filling out those sample submission sheets, as much information as you can include as possible is going to be ideal for me. So where is the plant located in the landscape? What day did you or your client notice this plant symptoms or the insect damage? What chemicals have recently been applied to the area, pesticides and fertilizers? What kind of irrigation is being used? And any other plant-specific details like the type of mulch or ground cover, how close is the plant to a home or another structure, a shed, and what kind of plants are nearby that might be competing with it for things like nutrients or water or light. And when you're submitting insects, again, the more details, the better. So did you find it on a host plant? Was it actively feeding on the plant? What part of the plant was it feeding on? Was it feeding on the stems? Was it feeding on the leaves? Did you find this on the roots? What time of day did you find it? And any images of damage caused can be really helpful too, because it might not necessarily be the insect that you see that caused the damage. And when submitting a physical sample through the mail, we would like for you to start using propylene glycol instead of an alcohol-based material to ship insects in. And this is because it's not a flammable material, so it's a bit safer to use for sending things in the mail. And your extension agents hopefully have some of this at their offices, but if not, you're welcome to contact me and I can send some directly to you, some vials full of it. And I wanted to mention a couple things about golf course plugs and lawn turf submissions. Photos, especially of symptoms of a lawn or a golf course at the landscape scale, are really, really helpful. And that's because the patterns of symptoms can support what I'm seeing under the microscope. And if you do include soil in these samples, this can help me rule out any pH problems. And this goes for any other plants too. If you submit about a cupful of soil, I can do a simple pH test here in the lab and rule out anything that might need to be corrected with that. And a lot of y'all have a lot more experience, a lifetime's worth of experience with the plants that you work with. And I just want to say that I have a policy of holding all samples that I get for at least 1 week. And I have a fancy new microscope camera now. So if I give you a diagnosis and you say, I'd like someone else to take a look at this, or could you take a picture of what you're seeing under the microscope, I am more than happy to go back and send you additional photos of what I'm seeing in terms of disease or in terms of what I think the abiotic cause might be, and send those to you so that you can have them for your records or for your clients. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the soil analyses that are available at the lab. So there are some pretty specific tests that are available based on the situation. So there are analyses for home lawn and garden situations, even potting mixes, raised bed analyses, and these can give you some pretty basic nutrient, pH, organic matter, soluble salts, texture analyses. And a lot of the time I might say, I suspect nutrient deficiency and recommend that you or your client send in soil or potting media for analysis. And submitting a physical soil sample, again, is the sample fee and shipping cost. And these are variable based on which tests that you and your client want done. So there are a lot of different screening available through the soil lab, including heavy metals, things like that. But to get to it, you're going to go to the home page of the Soil Plant and Pest Center, up to the Soil Fertility tab. And under Soil Fertility, you have all of these different options. And I suspect that y'all would be using the lawn and garden and potting mix, raised beds tabs most frequently. And again, you're going to find sampling instructions, the soil submission sheet, how to ship your soil, all of those instructions and good information there. Another thing, not just that I might recommend above and beyond just a soil test, might be a plant tissue nutrient analysis. So sometimes getting an analysis of the nutrients in the plant tissue is also going to be a good way to tell if there's a nutrient deficiency in your plant. Again, this is a variable cost depending on what you want analyzed, and all of the good information on how to submit, how to sample your plants and ship them is going to be on the website. I want to talk a little bit about the lab samples that were submitted in 2020. Most of them from the Eastern region where y'all are. So most of the physical samples that we got were for a plant pathogen diagnosis. Only a couple were from herbicide injury, so that's good that herbicides are being used correctly for the most part. I do want to say we're not able to diagnose positively if herbicide is the direct cause of injury, especially if there are herbicides still in the soil. We get a lot of questions about that, but there are some labs that will test for herbicides. And if you're interested in having links to those labs, I can send you those. So you can email me if you're interested in that information. And then a lot of the times we are going to say it's not just one pathogen, it's not just one environmental factor that's causing the disease. It might be a combination of things. So I also wanted to talk about nothing detected diagnosis. A lot of the times this could be from environmental factors like Alan was talking about earlier with a drought or water stress, over underwatering. Sometimes we get healthy plants. Again, sometimes it's a nutrient deficiency or toxicity, and I'll recommend that test through the soil lab. A lot of times it might be that you need to inspect or send a lower part of the plant. So a lot of times we only get the foliage, we only get upper stems, and it might be a wood-boring insect in the trunk of a tree that's causing damage or vectoring a fungus into the tree. Or it might be a root rot pathogen and we haven't gotten a sample of the roots to test or inspect. Or we just need additional context because it might be that the plant is not in the most suitable place. So we need a little bit more information to make sure that the plant's in as healthy a situation as possible. And this is just a quick list of some of the most common plants received from the Eastern region last year. Lots and lots of evergreens, quite a variety of flowers in terms of ornamentals, lots of deciduous trees, a couple of turf samples, woody ornamentals. And of these, the stars are probably the things that I diagnosed the most since coming in August. So lots of arborvitae, and we had lots of arborvitae leaf miner as an insect pest and spruce spider mites on arborvitae and some of the other spruces, evergreen plants. So one thing that I think would be really helpful if you don't already have one would be to get a hand lens and look for some of these really tiny insects. If you're seeing stippling damage on evergreen plants, another good way to see if you have spider mites is to keep a piece of paper or a notepad and just tap the branches onto that light colored piece of paper to see if you have any insects moving around after that, because we did see a whole lot of spruce spider mites. A lot of the cankers that we're seeing, again, I think are weaker pathogens that moved in after the drought stress that these evergreens were subject to, even as far back as 2019. So making sure that those plants are getting adequate water during a dry period is really important. Bacterial leaf scorch. Lots and lots of bacterial leaf scorch symptoms. We are about to get molecular PCR testing capability here in the lab, and I am interested in setting up a serological test option to confirm bacterial leaf scorch. So I'm excited about that. The symptoms are pretty unique, but if I had that test available, I think I would feel better about my diagnosis of that, but we saw a lot of this. And in terms of boxwoods, lots and lots of boxwoods. I think I saw more boxwoods than anything this fall. And again, lots and lots of boxwood mite, boxwood leaf miner, lots of volutella and macrophoma and blight. I would say that the boxwood blight came in later in the year, so more in the fall than in the late summer. Volutella and Macrophoma were definitely present on those stressed boxwoods though. And there was a lot of boxwoods with considerable amounts of water stress, so lots of overwatering. If you look down near the soil line, lots of adventitious roots growing above the soil line, showing that the boxwoods were sitting in too much water. The water wasn't draining well. So checking the root area with boxwoods is definitely important there. And I wanted to share this resource with y'all. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, but I tend to use it a lot, especially for commercial applicators. This is a really good integrated pest management resource called the Crop Data Management System. And it's got a really great search option, so you can come down and look up pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, rodenticides, anything really pesticide-wise here. You type in your crop or your site, the pest that you're trying to target once I've given you my diagnosis, Tennessee. And what's great about this too is if you have a client who's interested only in using organic products, you can select only for organic products available in Tennessee. And it'll give you a good list of all the products that are labeled for use in Tennessee and the active ingredient, the label, everything kind of all in one place. So if I give you a recommendation and I maybe give you a fungicide or an insecticide and it's in a class of insecticides or pesticides that you've been using frequently and you're looking for an option in a different class so that you're practicing good rotations of chemical classes, this is a really great resource. So again, our website is soillab.tennessee.edu. This is a relatively new change to the website, so just so you know, we're at this web location now. And for my area, we're at Plant Pests. And my email is just my first name at utk.edu. And I'm also on Twitter if you want to follow me there. And if you have any questions, I can answer them. I think I went pretty fast, so I'm sorry.
That was great, Eleanor. Thank you. And, you know, I think Alan brought up a good point yesterday. You know, the Soil Plant and Pest Center isn't just for Nashville or just for extension agents. It's for, you know, everyone in Tennessee. So thank you for covering that.
Yeah, I was going to bring up the fact, too, that, you know, being a county agent here in Chattanooga, and I know Lee gets samples in, we're the conduit to Eleanor. Actually, people cannot send a distance diagnostics. They have to go through us. But that makes it good for you as a business person. You know, as a business, I try to encourage my landscapers to turn it into a fee service. You know, you may not think you know much, or maybe you think you know it all, but we all think that. But if there's a way to turn that $15 that it's going to cost, let's say if you send it directly, that sample, you may roll that into a, you know, let's say a $50 charge for diagnosis or something like that, and turn it into a fee kind of service. And then be sure and take pictures, send them to Lee and I, you know, through email or whatever. And then we can often turn that around pretty quickly and get that information back to you. And then you can act like you're the smart person out there, which we all want to do, want to present a real good show to the clients. But I often see that, and those of you who pick up on it really quickly, I've worked with several people that are real regulars. They come in, bring a sample, or they take a picture. Often I can see your picture and turn it right around within 5 minutes and get that sample up to Eleanor or Frank or Alan, and they usually do a pretty darn good diagnosis. And it actually saves you $15, because maybe later after that, they'll ask that you send in a sample, then the $15 comes in, and then it's a little bit harder for you to collect the sample, put it in a bag, make sure it's all right. So think about that distance diagnostics. Make sure you turn that into a moneymaker. I think it can be a pretty good way of doing it. I don't know what people would cost. Does anybody have? We've got plenty of time here. I was also going to prompt everyone on the call today that at the end of January, actually after the 4th session, and I know a lot of people are signed up for all 4, at least till the end of January. At the end of that, we're going to send out an email that's going to ask you to send us a survey on kind of what you've done throughout the year. And a couple of the key questions are, how many samples did you submit to the soil lab? Or how many samples did you submit for diagnosis? And you may have to think about that. I'll give you 2 weeks to think about it, but we're gonna have those questions on there. So you may not think that you sent in very many. I often go to the soil lab every year for my report and see how many samples were sent in by homeowners or anybody. And often I don't see that number that is very high. And I think either people don't realize it, but I think the way to realize it is through the landscapers. The landscapers should be out there promoting it. If you say a customer needs a soil test, again, $15, but I wouldn't, I don't know. Does anybody want to put in the chat or speak up on how they monetize a $15 soil test? Because I'm sure if you took it for the client, it'd probably take you a good hour, and you might have to roll that into a $50, $100 charge. I'm not sure how you would do that. So anybody want to speak up or chat about that a little bit? We've got a good 15, 20 minutes to mull over that. They're asking heavy metal tests. How much does that cost?
And Tom, I've got a few questions for Eleanor in the chat box as well. Do you want me to read those out while people are thinking about how to manage those soil tests?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Eleanor, Lynn said, so nice to meet you. I work with native plants, so I select species based on existing soil conditions and what plants would be suited to that specific environment. What can a soil sample teach me about my site and what would like to grow there?
That's a good question. So if you're working with native plants and not trying to modify the soil with external inputs, it's probably going to tell you what will grow best there without having to drastically modify the soil. So the pH is probably going to be one of the best indicators, because some plants really like acidic pH and some plants do better in closer to alkaline pH. So, and it'll also tell you if the soil is severely depleted in a certain essential nutrient or important nutrient that your plant's going to need to survive in.
Lynn asked a second question here, Eleanor. My rain garden bioretention sites serve as a bioremediation purpose. How much does testing for heavy metals cost? Do you know that offhand, Eleanor?
So the heavy metal screening is $40.
Okay.
There is a specific test for the bioponds, but I'm not sure if that's more of like a commercial test, I think. So I don't know if that would necessarily apply or be most useful for a home garden retention pond. It's more like commercial contractors that we see use the biopond testing, because they have to meet certain state regulations for levels of different materials in those ponds.
These are for parking lots, large areas, municipal sites.
Okay, it might be really good for you to use then.
Great, thanks.
I might just speak. This is Manny Bedwell. I'm an extension agent in Hamlin County in Morristown. Back to your question. I'm not going to name any company names, but I do know a couple of turf management companies that will advertise that we are going to use the UT soil test lab recommendations to do our fertility program with. You know, we're not going to use a cheap home kit from a big box store to try to differentiate their, you know, treatment. And then when they get the results back, they'll actually show, you know, the homeowner what the test was. And so that's one way companies are doing it, to try to distinguish that they're professional and they're using, you know, university soil test results rather than just, you know, a big box store cheapo type thing. So, or just trying to do it without even doing any soil test recommendations. So that's one way some of the turf care companies are using the lab, I know, just to try to differentiate that they're doing it in a more professional way.
Exactly. Thanks, Manny. That's perfect way to describe that. Let's see. Somebody said they're charging at least $50 for diagnosing a website. That's pretty good. That's what I mean. I think it's a good value for your customer because they have to go through the process. It's not just $15, you know, total cost. You know, it takes a lot of effort, and a lot of homeowners, they could kill their own dandelions if they wanted to for $10, but that's why they have a professional landscaper come and do it for them. And I think by having such a great service, I think what we have up there in Nashville right now is as good as any in any state. I think we've got all the facilities. We've been working on it for several years, and we've got the whole lab here today, didn't we?
Yeah, I got a quick question about that. This is Charles Beatty with Knox Tree Care. I have not used the service before, but I've thought about it. And the one big thing that kind of stands out to me is I haven't seen the report itself, but I'm curious as to how legible and meaningful that would be to a homeowner. So when you're talking about upselling the soil test, you know, the one thing that stands out to me is not only selling the soil test itself, but then selling functionally recommendations, but interpretations of that. So, I mean, like I said, I haven't put the time into like how I would personally do it, but I've thought about if I was going to sell this, I might say, I'm going to get the test. I'm going to provide you with the results of the test, and I'm going to provide, say, a write-up, which is what the test means or what I think you should do with it, et cetera. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Dr. Robert Florence is our soil lab PhD, and he is the one who interprets and helps with the running of all of the soil testing, all of the plant tissue testing, and he does take into consideration. And when you go to fill out the form, you can say or give a little bit of details about the situation. So he can provide a diagnosis that's more tailored for a homeowner to understand and interpret. So he does a really good job of that. And those go out as emails of what the exact nutrients were, what all of the results of the tests, and then when to apply more fertilizer, what kind of fertilizer he recommends to apply. All of that good information is in there, and he's really good about answering any questions if there still are any after that recommendation is provided.
Okay. So it sounds like kind of what Thomas was saying earlier about the, having a relationship with the people we're submitting these to. After having submitted a few, you get a feel for what they're sending. You ask for something extra if you need it. And it sounds like you're saying that he would be able to provide some level of tailoring of the interpretation if necessary.
Yes.
Great.
And Charles, you can also reach out, or anyone on the call, to your own county agent. We have the ability to pull up those same soil tests, so we can look at those with you as well and make sure, if there is extra support needed, certainly we can reach out to Dr. Florence as well, come up with a good plan.
Are you my county agent?
I am.
Cool. I thought so. Just making sure.
And I've often thought how a business could connect all the bulletins that are put out, all those great bulletins Alan was showing, and how to do the diagnosis. There's just a ton of things that, and I don't expect a landscaper to have all those in their car, to present those. But when they get a diagnosis, it'd be nice, especially when there's a hot problem. Like it seems like you'd want to have a few boxwood bulletins in your trunk somewhere, with all that going on, or Leland cypress, whatever's their hot topic. It'd be good to have that there. That way your client would kind of feel like, again, the professionalism that you're imparting. It isn't just your business, but you're being backed up basically by the places where you're paying your tax money, to me and to Eleanor and everybody, and you should get your money's worth.
A couple other comments. And, tell the client a good doctor does not write a prescription without a solid understanding of what is going on. Soil tests are essential to help track progress. Dates are always good, of course, we've learned. So make sure you're listing dates when you're taking soil tests. And Eleanor, we have one other question. Do you have the capability to diagnose Phytophthora down to a species?
So at the moment, I have to rely on morphological testing and culturing of Phytophthora, but in the very near future, we will have the ability to sequence to species. So that's really exciting. And if you are needing a really specific species diagnosis, I can send it to another lab to have it sequenced and identified to species, but some Phytophthora species are identifiable just based on the host plant if I do a more general test. So it's kind of case dependent, but soon I will be able to offer that as well. Yes.
What's the status of nematode sampling? Are you farming that out, or is that something?
So I love nematodes. I don't love them causing plant disease, but I can do some basic ID if I'm able to extract them from, if there are a whole bunch present in a root sample, or if there are enough present in their foliar nematodes. Sometimes the magnification on the microscopes I have is not strong enough, but an inverted microscope to allow me to see them well would definitely be something that I'd like to get a hold of in the future. But if it is a serious nematode problem, and I think that it should be sent to a nematology specific diagnostic lab, I'll refer you to that. There's a good lab in Mississippi that we usually refer people to.
Well, Eleanor, thank you very much for the presentation.
Frank, welcome.
Yeah. Okay. So up next, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Frank Hale with the University of Tennessee. He's a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology at the Soil and Plant Pest Center. Received his PhD in entomology from the Ohio State University. And his work focuses on diagnosis and management of insect and mite pests of ornamental plants, turf grasses, fruits, vegetables, and tobacco. Has a lot of interest, including, IPM, invasive pest monitoring, and of course, macro photography. I've seen some of Frank's stuff, and it's always beautiful images. So we're happy to have you today, Frank, and take it away.
Okay, thanks, Lee. Thanks, Tom. Well, it's great to be here today. And, I think we often make everything a little too complicated. Insects are, you see them every day. You're out there in the landscape more than I am, truthfully. And just keep your eyes open and make some good observations. You should become really proficient at identifying insects. There's lots of resources. I'm going to talk about some of those today, but you should be able to know a lot about the insects. And of course, I'm here to give presentations throughout the year and cover a lot of the pests and how to control them. So as far as you guys go, just think to yourself, write it down if you want to on a sheet of paper. What are the 10 or so pests that you most often see or most often have to treat? And the thing with insects is they pretty much show up every year. You know, a lot of people say it's going to be a real cold winter, or is that going to kill all the insects? No. Insects are acclimated to this climate. They're going to survive. And they're often in an egg stage or a pupal stage or some resting stage that allows them to get through the winter. Some overwinter as adults. But year in, year out, you're going to see a lot of the same pests. Now, that's not to say that some pests are going to be worse some years than others. That's where you have to, because there's differences in the conditions. Just like Dr. Windham talked about, a wet, cool spring might be bad for anthracnose. Well, certain conditions will be more favorable for certain insects. So if you have azaleas, you're probably going to see some azalea lace bugs. If you have Leland cypress and arborvitae, bagworms, you might as well depend on it. And the nice thing about bagworms, you drive through the neighborhood, you see the little bags hanging on the tree, and there's an instant potential customer because most folks don't do anything for them, and conifers especially can be ruined. How about the level of control that you're providing to your customers? Are you doing it? I don't want you guys going out there and just spraying on a calendar. That's old school. You need to be sampling. You need to be making sure you have a pest. And then if you see it there, then treat. But are you doing things efficiently? So that means you're going to have to do some scouting. You're going to have to follow up and say, did I do a good job of controlling those scale insects? Did I actually kill them? Or do I need a second application of insecticide? Same with imported fire ants. You have opportunities in the spring to control them when they become active, when things warm up. And I like to follow up in the fall and go back. And if you see any more mounds, that's the time to hit them again, because any disturbed area, especially new neighborhoods where they're disturbing the soil, that's where the fire ants like to make their nest. So those areas, any new developments, you're going to see fire ants. So be aware of that. What about your management plan? Think of each type plant you see. And, you know, we have only a finite number of plants that we see regularly, you know, dogwoods, whatever, azaleas, hydrangea, whatever it is. What do you need to keep that plant healthy? What types of diseases and insects do those plants get? And this information is out there. Dr. Windham talks about it. I talk about it. It's in a lot of our publications. So you can pretty much map out for this type plant, I need to look for these diseases, these insects. So you can pretty much, depending what time of year it is, you can almost, if there's something bothering, you have a good idea of what it is. So we have a lot of resources for pest information. Some of you guys, the county agents, are well aware of these, but others might not be. Years ago, I sent the first edition of this Garden Insects of North America to all the county extension offices, all 95. They've come out with a second edition, Dr. Cranshaw and Dr. Shetler now, and it is one of the best books that you can get. It has over 700 digital images. It, 700 pages, and I think 3,000 or so images. So it is an amazing book, and it's like in the $20, $25 range through Amazon. Very inexpensive. but it's a nice book that has so many good images of all the insects probably you're going to see in the landscape. So if you don't have that, pick it up, Garden Insects in North America. As far as UT Extension publications, if you look at the top right there, you'll see the SP 290, looks like O, and that's the number on that. And when you go to, if you just go Google UT Extension publications, it'll take you a place, and there'll be a little box. And if you just type in SP 290O, it'll bring boxwood leaf miner. It's a 2-page fact sheet. Most of our fact sheets are just a couple pages. If you put Frank Hale in there, it will give all my publications. So it'll be multiple screens. Put Alan Windham, you'll get all his disease publications, including the new rose disease publications. So it's all easily available. You know, when I first came here in '92, each county office had just banks of drawers with fact sheets in them where they had printed them out. Now you can print out as many of these you want from your home computer or office computer, and have these available to hand out to homeowners so they know what you're doing, you know, what you're dealing with. Fairly new fact sheets, Arborvitae leaf miner. Had some reports from East Tennessee of kind of brown tips on Arborvitae, kind of looked like winter damage. And we take a closer look, you see the little red arrow, you see a little round exit hole on the underside of that needle, where the little leaf miner is actually a type of caterpillar. It's a Lepidoptera leaf miner. And, you know, Arborvitae is native to here, and this insect is too, but we just hadn't seen it that much in Tennessee. It started in East Tennessee. We're seeing it spread around a little bit more. But so if you see a lot of brown tips on Arborvitae, it might be this. And it tells you how to manage them, what time of year the moths come out, and when to treat. So it's a nice little publication. Most of these fact sheets then have a link to our control recommendations, which are in bigger publication. Here's one that Dr. Amy Fulcher, I believe, put together, Scouting and Monitoring Pest and Deciduous Trees During Nursery Production, but still has some nice ideas that you could do to use for scouting and monitoring. You see that little trap there? It looks like bottles, soda bottles. That's for, you put a little ethyl alcohol in that, and it brings in ambrosia beetles. So you would do this in late winter, early spring, and because the ambrosia beetles overwinter as adults, and they'll go right to that ethyl alcohol because stressed trees release volatiles such as ethyl alcohol. And these beetles have co-evolved with these trees over millions of years, and they know a stressed tree when they smell it. And they'll go and attack that tree, often when it's still dormant. And so every year I will put out similar traps, these traps, or a lingering trap, which is a funnel trap. And whenever I start catching ambrosia beetles, I send out alerts to all the county agents across the state, and Tom then can send that out to you. So you know to put protective sprays on for ambrosia beetles on your really high quality, expensive little specimen trees especially. Here's something I did years ago, Decision Making Handbook for Insect and Mite Pests. It talks some about, you know, all different kind of things that you can do from scouting to degree day models, a lot of different things. So take a look at that. The publication I probably spend the most time on each year is our Commercial Insect and Mite Control for Trees, Shrubs, and Flowers. And you can see the URL at the bottom. So extension.tennessee.edu/publications. And that will take you, and then you can look up certain documents, certain publications. This one, the PB number or the document number is PB 1589. And this thing, I think, is 89 pages or so. Pretty good publication. It starts out with seasonal appearance of ornamental pests, normal time frame to apply control measures. I'll just show you an example of that. Then it goes in, talks a little bit about micro injections. It has a lot of table 1 and table 2 have a lot of good information in them. Here's on page 2. So at the dormant period before growth starts, it will list in alphabetical order some common host plants: arborvitae, ash, elm, euonymus. And it'll just sort of list, well, what you might see that time of year. Okay, so dormant before growth starts, you might still see spruce spider mite eggs. The orange eggs might not be hatched yet, but very soon they will be hatching, usually about the time the new growth starts. You might see scale insects on some of these plants. You know, when the leaves are off, that's a great time to examine the twigs for scale insects. Like an oyster shell scale is an armored scale. You can see on elm, there's quite a number of different potential scale pests. And same for euonymus. So a good time of year to look at plants for these persistent problems like scale is when the leaves are off the tree. It's just easier to examine them. Late March to April, early April, you'll see maybe boxwood psyllid on boxwoods. But this just gives you sort of an idea. Look what time of year it is in general. If it's going to be a real warm spring, it might speed this calendar up. This is just a general year-to-year thing, but it sort of gives you an idea of what you'll see throughout the season. Here's a little later, you'll see azalea lacebug, of course, psyllid again. The eastern tent caterpillar, one of the first caterpillars to hatch from eggs, right when leaves are just starting to come out. So that's, you can see a lot of maybe white pine aphid might be showing up, some different things. And we have the Nantucket pine tip moth. We have a fact sheet on that, how to time sprays. So if you have a Christmas tree grower, for instance, that's very helpful publication. If you get into, I believe this is table 2. This is our biggest table in this publication, and it just starts out in alphabetical order with pests like arborvitae, azalea, and it just lists all the potential insect pests and mite pests that I might think you would see. So when we talk about aphids, let's just look at the top. We're talking about a dormant application of oil. When I say dormant oil, I'm usually talking about a horticultural oil, but it's made as a dormant application. What's a horticultural oil? Well, on the label, it's going to say it will have dormant or winter application rates, usually higher, and it will have summer rates, usually lower. And so you can use this highly refined oil both winter, year-round, basically. And it's very effective. It's fairly inexpensive. It's a lot less expensive than miticides. And if you do have persistent scale insect problems, you want to you get on an oil spray regimen. And that's something you can do during late winter, early spring before the leaves come out. So February, March, let's say. Then once that aphid hatches from eggs or becomes active, then you have a lot of other options of insecticides to use. So some of these insecticides are for, you'll have to read the label. Some are for landscape use, some are for nursery. I kind of mix them up in here, but it gives you a lot of different options. There's more than just 7, okay? There's more than just Tall Star, a lot of different products. And there's our arborvitae leaf miner that we just talked about, the fact sheet. So that fact sheet would refer you to this publication, and you can see all the different treatment options for that. So if you're not using this publication, I'm working too hard, and because this is where I spend a lot of my time making sure you have the most up-to-date insecticide recommendations and other control recommendations. In 2017, a bunch of entomologists, plant pathologists, and weed scientists and others put together this Southeastern U.S. pest control guide. And there's a nice little azalea lacebug on the front cover, isn't it? And this has lots of good information too. It's like 205 pages long. I looked online, you can actually buy this thing. A hard copy, it's like $20 or so, or in the 20s. But I believe it's available online too. I have it online version. So you should have this, and it talks a lot about the insecticides and the modes of action. So you will rotate and not just use the same mode of action year after year. In that similar vein, before we put out that publication, Bill Klingeman, J.C. Chong, and I put together this Ornamental Plant Pest Management Guide and Pesticide Rotation Planning Aid, because we wanted nurserymen and landscape managers to rotate and not use the same mode of action, insecticides and miticides, because there's a lot of choices out there and we need to rotate so we don't get resistance to pesticides. And you can see the W number there means web only. This is available. This resource is, if you really want to, this is like, you could take a course in insecticides by studying this publication. J.C. Chong put the lion's share of work on this, and it looks at insecticides and miticides and the mode of action for each one of these groups. And it is really amazing publication. So if you get time and you really want to study and see what the difference is in insecticides and their characteristics, take a look at this. Again, available online. Insecticide and miticide mode of action field guide. W415 is our publication number. So let's look here at what we would see in the fall. Okay, sometimes late fall, late summer into fall is when these pests are starting to think about overwintering. Not all insects become active in the spring, lay eggs and have crawlers hatch out. A good example is tulip tree scale and magnolia scale, where a lot of scale insects will hatch out in the spring and have several generations. These only have one generation a year, and the crawlers actually emerge late August and into September. And they don't all come out at one time. You'll notice with scale insects, if they all came out at one time, we could maybe spray them once and get great control, but often they dribble out over a period of time, and you have to go back and see if they're still emerging. You might have to treat a couple times. Azalea lace bugs, it's important to control them as they get into the late summer and fall, because they're going to lay their eggs that overwinter on the underside of the leaves. So you're going to have some in the spring if you don't control them more in the fall. Here shows you the tulip tree scale. The worst thing about it, I think, as much as anything, is they produce so much of the sticky honeydew, which is clear. It's going to drip on your clients' porches and decks and cars and whatever. And then the sooty mold is a fungi that feeds on the sugary substrate, turns everything black. And you can see here that ants are actually tending these scale insects. They're collecting the sugary honeydew, taking it back to their nest, and any parasitoid wasp and any predators and such that try to feed on these scale, they might even attack and chase away. So sometimes for scale control, we'll spray an insecticide around the base of the trunk of the tree, because ants and other insects that go up and down the tree, it will help control them so they don't protect the scale as much. Okay, let's look at lace bugs. Spray active stages. So you can see here, you don't want to spray during bloom. So with something that blooms like a azalea lace bug, if they haven't hatched out from the eggs prior to bloom, just wait till after bloom, then treat, and that way you're going to save your pollinators. Now, some folks will use neonicotinoid insecticides as a time management tool, and you can apply those earlier. The only negative is you could get some of that insecticide could end up in the flower, in the nectar or pollen. So if you have clients that are worried about that, I do not worry so much about that for this reason, because you're just treating individual plants here and there in a landscape. Most azaleas are never treated with any insecticide in a given year. So there's plenty of alternative plants for pollinators to be on. So if you treat an individual plant because it needs it, I don't worry that much about it. It's perfectly legal to use. But if you want to be a little more protective, instead of the drench, you can just wait till it blooms and then spray afterwards. Another thing that we will see in the fall will be spider mites, such as spruce spider mites and southern red mites. And you can see that they'll get more active in the spring and the fall. They're considered cool season mites. And so their eggs will be laid in the fall that will overwinter. Canna, we have a lot of, once you get that killing frost, cut that plant debris off, get rid of it, because the pupa from the canna leaf rollers will be in there. And that's what I did this year. I just bagged it all up and got rid of it. Four-line plant bugs, they also lay their eggs in plant debris or plant stubble. So just cut the plants off and take them out of there, and you'll have fewer in the spring. Let's look at some of these leaf rollers. This is you can see this type canna leaf roller I don't generally see as often. The adult of this, I believe, is a skipper type. It's not a type of butterfly called a skipper, and it's not the one that keeps the whorls from unfurling, but it will actually chew pieces of leaf and fold them over and then web them down and be underneath their feeding. So it's a interesting one. I saw this a little later in the summer. You can see the raggedy looking leaves is what you'll see. The lesser canna leaf roller you can see here, it will actually web up the whorls. And so then you can't, the whorl won't open, the flowers it doesn't bloom as well. And this is what most people see the most. And this is probably going to take some insecticide down into the whorl. I usually open them up, but that's pretty time consuming. But I had a lot of time this summer to hang out in the garden. But you can see they will hit about every one of these whorls. If you open them up, this is what the caterpillar looks like. So it's feeding on the layer of the leaf there. The moth is just a small beige moth. And you can actually see other things hanging around, like that tree frog. I don't know if he eats the caterpillars or not. I think he was just resting. So what are some insecticides? Well, we have BT products. We have orthene. Might work pretty good because it's systemic. So you'll get some, if you get it on the leaf, it'll go through there from one side to another. Various pyrethroid insecticides, Conserve SC, which is a really good product to use if you don't, for caterpillars in general. Real safe to use for your landscape professionals that are out there. And a new product called, fairly new product called Acelepryn. Kind of pricey, but it's systemic also. So this is what you'll see once the larvae go through their development. They will pupate, and they'll put just a little bit of silk to stick them so they don't drop off the leaf. And then that's where they're going to be in that leaf as it dries up. They're going to be in there in the pupal stage until next spring and early summer. So if you get rid of that, get rid of the pupa, you have fewer of these moths flying around. Okay, here's the four-line plant bug. What's that look like? The damage always reminds me of some kind of bacterial damage because the saliva from this plant bug. It's a mirrored plant bug. It can break down cell contents. It's very toxic to the cells. So they inject the saliva, it liquefies the plant, then they slurp up through a second tube the liquid food. And so these hatch out in the spring. They love mints and a lot of different type plants. But you'll see similar type spotting. If you see that on lots of different non-related plants in a plant bed, it's probably a 4-line plant bug and not a disease. You can shake the plant and you can see the little red nymphs, and as they get older, you'll see the 4 black lines in the yellow stripes. Here's a little red nymph there, and you can see what they did to that spearmint there. Did quite a bit of blackening of the leaves. When it's all done and the leaves look bad, just prune back your plants and they come back nice and clean, because these only are out in the spring and early summer. They're gone, and after that, they go in the egg stage. So eggs will be laid in that stubble, so cut off that old plant material at the end of the year and dispose of it, and hopefully you'll have fewer of these next year. See the coleus? A lot of different plants get hit by 4-line plant bug. So here we are in winter. It is cold. Horticultural oil sprays are going to be very useful. You want to wait till a day where it warms up into the 50s. Hopefully it's going to stay kind of warm overnight too. And we'll have plenty of those days in February and March where you can get out and treat scale insects. There's a lot of aphids will overwinter as either adults or eggs. Adelgids are similar to aphids. They're like the hemlock woolly adelgid. Of course, spruce and southern red mite eggs, and even rust mites, which are actually active as adults in other stages during the winter time. Tulip tree scale, if you didn't really get them completely controlled, this crawler stage in August or September, they're going to molt into a second instar nymph that will actually overwinter. And so these you can hit with horticultural oil sprays, because they're not very big yet. They're still small. It's not till the spring, when the plant really comes out overwintering, it's actively growing, that those female scale will then molt to adults, and they really start growing in size and swelling up, and then those adults will lay the eggs later in the summer. But you can put some oil sprays on during this dormant period to help control these. And notice they're kind of a blackish color. Now this armored scale, the Euonymus scale, feeds on the leaves and stems. If you notice there, the females are the grayish or the grayish red color, and more of those tend to be on the stems. They have a little better protected area. The white ones are that have the white waxy covering. Armored scale have waxy coverings that you can lift off to see the insect underneath. The white rod-shaped coverings are the males. And you can see that there tend to be more males on the leaves, more females on the twigs, but then a combination maybe on the underside of the leaf. If you get high populations, you can get branch dieback. Fortunately, with plants like Euonymus, you can prune them back pretty severely, let the new foliage come out and protect it from then on. These have 3 generations a year, so you have plenty of opportunities to control this pest. As far as spruce mite control, of course, the oil sprays are very effective. So if you have these eggs on there during the winter, this horticultural oil will kill many of those eggs. Often you don't even have to treat in the spring if you do a really good job. But if you do treat in the spring, you can really control them almost completely then. And you'll see very little damage. The damage people see in the spring is the feeding in the last fall caused that chlorotic look, and they say, oh, it looks like winter damage. But what it is that mite damage. And if you let it persist and keep going, and don't control it in the winter or spring, it's just going to get worse. On southern red mites, you'll see the on a broadleaf evergreen. This happens to be a cherry laurel. That leaf should be very dark green, and also already in May or so, you can see that it has all sorts of little chlorotic spots where that sucking mite took out the chlorophyll, the cell contents. So oil spray would have helped, but you're going to have to spray the underside of those leaves. And these mites are very dark red color, so you can actually see them on the leaves. The little white things you see associated with the mites, if you look with a hand lens, those are the shed skins. The eggs are going to be reddish orange. The other type mite that we often see in landscapes and nurseries are area-phyid mites, and these are even tinier than spider mites. This is the spruce rust mite, but we can also see a hemlock rust mite on hemlock. And if you have bald cypress, you often notice those needles are bronzed. And there's a bald cypress rust mite. And these mites are on the spruce one and the hemlock. They're active during the winter. So warm days, you'll just see them out and about on the needles. So oil sprays will contact anything that's exposed like that. So we can use oils, or we can wait till fall or spring. Control with, again, oil can be used, horticultural oil. Look at the cedar or hair on the back of that little mite. Notice these are oblong or teardrop shaped. Most legs are at the front end, but this one has these little real long cedar hairs. We found from our some of our studies on rose rosette, the mite that transmits that disease, that tall star is very effective. Avid, a little less so, but Akari you might not be familiar with, but landscapers can use it. And forbid, very effective on these. But I think Avid spray would probably get you pretty good control too. The area-phyid mites that we control on roses like to hide down in the niche, the little tight places where the leaf stems develop, and they're harder to get the miticide too. But these are out exposed on the needles, should be very easy to control. Notice the eggs are white or milky white, clear color. So there might be some eggs out, but you'll actually have live active forms out. What else are we going to be seeing as we get into spring? Ambrosia beetles, like the granulate ambrosia beetle, boxwood leaf miner, lace bugs, lots of different spring caterpillars, and even some sawflies. So let's look at some of these. Granulate ambrosia beetle, you can see here, pushes out strands of sawdust like frass. They're chewing nice tunnels or galleries straight into, just like if you took a drilled right into the tree. Then they make a right or left turn generally. And what they're doing, they're making a nice clean brood gallery in which to lay their eggs. And it's going to be very moist in there. And then inside that gallery, they're going to inoculate it with the ambrosial fungi. It's a white fungus on which the larvae and adults can feed. So they kick all the sawdust out, make a nice clean gallery. There's the white ambrosial fungi. And these little orangish ambrosia beetles, we used to call them Asian ambrosia beetle because they came from Asia. And they changed the name a few years ago. But you can see the white ambrosial fungi. And that's adult female beetle, and she's only 3 millimeters long. Often they attack trees that are stressed and even still dormant, but they're still releasing ethyl alcohol, and that's what brings them in. Here shows a close-up of those traps again. I mentioned earlier, the one at the bottom you can make for about $4, excluding the cost of the ethyl alcohol lure. I get a semi-permeable little bag type lure that will last a whole season, but you can just put some cotton wicking and just put grain alcohol in there to bring them in. The other trap is called a lingering trap. It's a little more expensive, but you can use it year after year. It's 8 funnels, and we use that to trap for all sorts of exotic type beetle pest. we actually spend probably $100,000 money from USDA APHIS to put out traps for exotic pests in Tennessee. It's called the Cooperative Agricultural Pest Survey. And we get a grant or a cooperative agreement, and I oversee that. And we have traps throughout the state, East, Middle, and West Tennessee, looking for a number of different pests. Pest of oak trees, pest of wood boring pest, pest of field crops. And so it's a very good program, because we can find things early, we can hopefully alert the people that would need to eradicate those pests before they get established. But if you do catch these in your trap, that's when they're flying. It's usually when it's 70-degree temperatures or more for a couple days. That's when you put your protective sprays on. The sprays we like to use are bifenthrin. That's same as Tall Star, but Onyx Pro and Onyx, these will have a higher rate that you can use on these trees. So you want to use that high rate, spray the bark. Might have to spray every 2 weeks or so. Same with Astro. Once these beetles are flying, your trees are susceptible. Let's look at the boxwood leaf miner again. Those leaves, it's only one generation a year. And you can see here that by late April, they're in the pupal stage. And then the adult little mints will come out. And usually by that first week or so of May, you've got egg laying occurring. So wait till the first week or so of May if you want to spray the foliage with systemic type insecticides. Of course, you can treat the root system with merit and imidacloprid and other neonics ahead of time, which is a good way to go. Here's sort of what you can do. You can spray the adults, but I would still recommend either a soil drench of a systemic root uptake type product, or spray the foliage after the eggs have been laid and they're starting to hatch out, usually by early May. New product you might want to look at is Mainspring GNL Greenhouse Nursery Landscape. Here's a little lace bug you're going to see, and this is what we're seeing in azalea. And azalea is a very resilient crop. It can have this kind of damage. It doesn't really seem to stress it out that much, but aesthetically, it's kind of, that one on the left is almost kind of pretty. It looks like a wintry type snow flocked azalea, but I don't think you really want your azaleas looking like that. On the underside of the leaf, you'll see the tiny tar spots or excrement. You'll see some of the adults and nymphs. So you want to treat these early so that that new foliage that comes out in the spring will be treated. Again, here's the time management tool of using the systemic type products as a soil drench early, or you can make a granular application of another neonicotinoid, or you can spray them. And again, if you're concerned about when it blooms, just treat right after bloom. But all these recommendations are in that PB 1589. So if you have that, you'll have all this type of information. As far as bagworms coming out, they overwinter as eggs inside the carcass of the dead adult female. She doesn't look like an adult moth. She never leaves the bag. The male moth actually comes to her to mate, and then she will lay eggs inside her body, and then she dies. And so you can literally crack her open. You have to, if you cut one of those bags open, you can see that some have females in them with eggs, and some are empty because the male left, and you can see the empty pupal case at the tip of the bag. But these will start to emerge, and so by early June, you want to have these treated. If you don't, they start doing this kind of stuff. They start defoliating trees, especially hard on conifers. You can see there, it looks like Alan, but I believe that might be his twin brother, Gary Windham, but he's 6'2" or 3. I'm not sure how tall. So you can see that's probably 20 foot of damage possibly in just 1 year to these conifers, and they're never going to look the same. But that just shows you the potential for damage. So you can save trees that would cost hundreds of dollars to replace just by spraying them one time with insecticide. Sometimes in the spring, we'll see defoliation from cankerworms. Leaves will all come out, and all of a sudden they start looking tattered, and you can almost get complete defoliation. You don't see it every year, but some years you do. Later in the summer, you're going to see the fall webworms. And you can see here the webbing. These will do the webbing out on the ends of the branches on walnuts and pecans and persimmons and plants like that. Often you can just prune them out, step on them. But if you do spray all the foliage around them as they go to feed on that, you'll control them. Some people like to use BT insecticides because there's a lot of natural control. So you don't want to kill your beneficial insects if possible. Sawflies, there are a lot of different sawflies out there. They look caterpillar-like, but note that the number of prolegs exceeds 5 pair. I think this example here has 8 pair of prolegs, including the ones at the tip, those fleshy legs. And if they have more than 5 pair, they're not Lepidoptera, they're not a caterpillar like Eastern tent caterpillar or a bagworm. They're actually a sawfly. And why does this matter? Because BT will not control sawflies. Sawfly is a hymenoptera, bee or wasp. Hibiscus will see a sawfly on it. You can see the bottom left there is a little kind of a dark, a little bee-like thing with an orange thorax. Then the bottom right, you'll see a little larvae, the sawfly larvae, and they will actually work these over. So a lot of insecticides will work, conserve will work, even imidacloprid, but BT will not work on sawflies. What are we seeing a little later in the year? Well, we're going to see imported fire ants as things start to warm up. Aphids, spruce mites, scales. I live in a neighborhood where we just are starting to get imported fire ants. And unfortunately, they're starting to do road work right out in front of our neighborhood. And as they disturb that soil, that's going to be a really great place for these fire ants to spread into. So we're going to make a big corridor for the next few years where fire ants are really going to spread because of the disturbed soil. The fire ants will fly up in the adult, winged adults. The reproductives fly up into the air, they mate, and then they fall to the ground or fly down to the ground and start their new nest or colonies. So if you have any new subdivisions, that's where you're going to see these the most. The two-step method is use bait when temperatures are warm. It's usually 70 degrees or more. You can throw a potato chip out there to see if the ants go to it. You want it dry, no dew, perfectly dry. Put those baits down in the spring and then another application in the fall. And they'll slowly take these nests out. It's the best way to control them. We have a commercial turfgrass insect control publication that you need to know about. It's PB 1342, and it has controls fire ants, armyworms, white grubs, bill bugs, the whole gamut, sod webworms. So check that out. What do we have here in the spring? In the spring, summer, and then especially into August on, we're going to see the Asian woolly hackberry aphid. It's the exotic invasive pest. And this produces lots of honeydew. And best control I've seen is just using soil drenches in the spring or early summer with imidacloprid. But you can see they have waxy covering, fluffy waxy covering, and they fly in August and September and disperse. I didn't see very many of them at all this year. I don't know what happened. The populations really crashed for whatever reason that was. What do we do in general for aphids? We have these malathion, orthene, the old organophosphate products, but then we have the neonicotinoids like merit or imidacloprid, especially very effective at low rates, very safe on mammals and other non-targets. We have a group of new products, Endeavor, Aria, Altus, Mainspring. A lot of new products out there can be used very safely on aphid control. And of course, oils and soaps, if you spray them directly, will help. As far as spider mites, we have a lot of new miticides out there. Here's the two-spotted spider mite, your hot season mite. And look at just this list of miticides now. We have a lot more than we've ever had. Avid and Lucid are older, but Akari, Sirocco is two different miticides. Magus is a new miticide. Floor mite's been around. It's a good one. Forbid's been around a while, but it's effective on all kinds of mites, aerified mites and others. Shuttle, Sultan, fairly new one. So lots of different modes of action, lots of different things for mite control. Here's Sirocco. It has abamectin, which is an avid, plus bifenazate, which I believe is floramide. So two different miticides you can use on landscape, nursery, greenhouse, interior scape, but also list pests. Abamectin kills more than just mites. And you can see it will work on some other type pests too. And there shows the broad mite. If you ever see some of that strep-shaped leaves, thin leaves, could be very tiny broad mites feeding in the apical meristem there. As far as scale insects, let's go real quick through some scale. Wax scales that we see, Indian wax scale, thick waxy plates. You can see these can be just picked off the plant if there's just a few, but they'll get on the leaves. And then you can see this wax scale. You can see the nymphs are not completely covered with the thick waxy plates. A lot easier to control if you had to spray them with a contact insecticide. Probably going to get better control with the neonicotinoid insecticides that are systemic within the plant to control those. But you can see these are producing honeydew, and you can see the black sooty mold too. The crepe myrtle bark scale is expanding across the state, first found in Shelby County. It was first found in Texas, but then very quickly we got it in Tennessee. Came from Asia, where crepe myrtle come from. It's a felt scale. We only have the azalea bark scale and this crepe myrtle scale. That's the only felt scales I'm aware of. But the female will make this waxy strands and makes a little covering over them. You can see all the sooty mold associated with this. So white polka dots, okay? Think that. During the winter, February or so, you'll see these overwintered stages. This is just a pencil size or smaller twig under magnification. And every little crack and crevice, you have the little nymphs overwintering. They look like Sonic Hedgehog. They're just little filaments coming out of them at this stage. Oil spray in the test has not worked that great for people, but I really think if I had oil out, I would try it. I think you get some control with the oil. You're not going to get complete control, but you can use that, and then you're going to have to do something in the spring as the stages develop. In the past couple of years, we've really seen it moving across the state. It's in Nashville for several years now. Last, I guess, October of 2019, we found it in Murfreesboro. We found it in West Haven subdivision in Franklin. We found it in Knox County. So now Dr. Grant and his graduate student are studying this right in Knox County, which helps because we're determining, more about how many generations it has, the life stages, does it have parasitoids and predators, and just how we can control this better. But look at that. That was in somebody's front yard in Murfreesboro. Once we told them what they had, they cut the plant down, coppiced it, and I'm sure it came up pretty clean. But it was really covered. It had to have been like that for several years, and nobody even asked what it was. Let's look at some soft scale real quick. Pine tortoise scale. You'll see these on Christmas trees, and you only see it on a tree here and there because the crawlers hitchhike on birds and other animals. but you can see the amount of black sooty mold associated with that. The timing to treat the crawlers would be early June to July. But again, I'd use horticultural oil to help control that. So I think we have maybe one more slide here or so. In general, for soft scale, we have the neonics as soil applied. Safari can be used a little later. It can also be applied to the trunk of the tree and absorbed through the bark, especially in thin bark trees. But it's faster uptake, so you use that closer to when the crawlers are emerging. Or you can use a lot of different foliar products. I like Fulcrum and Talus. Those are insect growth regulator products. Use that with maybe 0.5% horticultural oil. Does a really good job for crawlers. Hey, if you need my contact information, there it is. And if you have any questions, if you can read those to me,
Thanks,
just
Frank.
give me a call anytime. That's my cell number. Hey, Tom.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think Lee will probably read a couple. One says, she has fire ants in our rain garden bioretention sites. Is the method you described safe for use so close to a waterway?
Yeah, the question is, the baits that we use have a very small amount of the toxicant. Sometimes it's an insect growth regulator, which is fairly safe, one of the more safer insecticides to use because it only works on arthropods. And it's very low amount. When you put bait out, the ants will take most of that bait up that first day. So as long as you don't have a golly washer rain 2 hours after you put your bait out, you're probably really good. So one thing to do is when you put your bait out, do it when it's not going to rain within 24 hours. The ants will take all that bait back to the nest, and then they liquefy that food and regurgitate it and feed the queen and then the immature ants. So I see no problem as long as you're not applying it to water. You want to keep it dry. Good question.
Yeah, so I've got another question here for you, Frank. We've been treating hackberries over parking lots for Asian woolly aphids for the last 3 years. In the late spring, we found several of those trees with large patches of cottony maple scale. Is imidacloprid known to be ineffective for that scale? Maybe they mean effective for that scale. I'm not positive on that.
Yeah, well, ineffective. Why isn't the imidacloprid? So you're applying imidacloprid in the spring, and then you're seeing some cottony maple scale. It should. It's a soft scale. It should be very effective on it. I'm a little surprised. The only thing that might be happening, it takes a month or more for imidacloprid to get up into the tree, into those leaves. So depending if you apply it real early in the spring, you might, just when bud break, it might be up into the tree by about June or so when you see those, I'm thinking. So it might just take longer to get up there into the plant. Now, Safari would get up there quicker. But again, the Asian woolly hackberry aphids and different things like that, they're going to be a little later in the summer. What were they trying to treat again? What was that?
Cottony maple leaf scale.
Yeah. Yeah, I think with imidacloprid, you just want to make sure you get it at least a month or so more in the soil and make sure there's plenty of good soil moisture, which there should be in the spring.
Okay. And one other one.
But
here.
if imidacloprid doesn't work, try Dinotefron or Safari.
Yeah.
Or you can spray with TriStar. There's other products.
Let's see, we have one other one. So on a deciduous tree with bagworms, why does the tree not simply re-leaf? I've seen several species die from bagworms, and this makes no sense.
A healthy tree coming out of overwintering should have plenty of energy to put out leaves, have a periodic defoliation, and refoliate. If that tree has a stressed root system from, let's say, the flash drought of, was that 2019 in September? Things like that, where it really had some root damage It was very stressed. It didn't put down the amount of starch reserves in those roots. So for some reason, it could have wood-boring insects. It could have root issues. It could have drought damage. For some reason, that plant was not as healthy as it should have been. A healthy plant would have survived easily. A deciduous plant.
Great, Frank. Thank you.
I'll give you a tip if you're looking for scale insects. Double-sided sticky Scotch tape, or tape with a little bit of thin layer of petroleum jelly. Make a little sticky trap. That will let you know, and then put some flagging tape there so you can find that branch. That will let you know when the crawlers are emerging on scale insects. So that's a nice little tip.
Lynn brought up a good point. Thanks, Frank. That was a great presentation. You suggested back in 2019 that the city of Chattanooga use native plants to encourage beneficial insects to help control lecanium cell on urban oak trees. Thanks for the support. So we will be talking about that at the arboricultural session back on January the 27th. So beneficials are great.
Yeah, and be careful when you're doing those mosquito sprays. Those can wipe out your parasitoid wasps and things that help control scale insects. So sometimes we have to do sprays for adult mosquitoes, but if we can control the larvae in stagnant water with larvicides, which are safe to put into the water, like Betias or Lentis, and we can keep those sources of the mosquitoes under control. Trash pickup, when you have a lot of trash containers, bottles and things with water in them, that's where mosquitoes can breed. So sanitation is very important, and it can keep your eventually could keep your trees healthier and the population healthier.
Great, Frank. Thank you.
I want to thank Frank and Alan and Eleanor one last time for this second of the four-part series. And we're looking forward to seeing most everybody next week. It'll be the second ornamental section.
I want to say one last thing. Send in your samples and just utilize what we have. We have a great resource at the Soil Plant Test Center.
Very good. I appreciate that. And I want to thank my partner, Lee Rumble, up there in Knox County, keeping us all straight. And Lindsay Cox, she's keeping up with all the names and everything. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in today.
Great to have everyone. Same to you, Tom.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Lee.